Hello, this is Raul Gonzalez, and I'll be presenting on gait development throughout our lifespan. I would like to start this presentation off first with this illustration. It illustrates us from our early childhood all the way to our older adulthood. I feel like this is a great illustration because it shows us from the beginning of life toward the end of life. So, that being said, I'd like to get into gait. We've been speaking about gait for a good amount of time, so I kind of like to just hit it real quick. So what is gait? Gait is the activity that occurs between the time one foot touches the floor and the time the same foot touches the floor again. So it can be broken down in two stages. To make it a little bit more simple, we have our stance phase, which takes up about 60% of our gait cycle, and this is anytime the foot is in contact with the floor. And the second phase is our swing phase. This is when basically our lead foot is in the air, like a mid-swing, stuff like that. And that takes up 40% of our gait cycle. Getting into our early childhood, in this stage, infants are learning how to walk. On average, it's about 12 months for an infant to begin to walk. Sometimes it's a little earlier and sometimes it's a little bit later. I am actually a father of a 16-month-old, and she began to walk at 9. So it varies. It varies on the infant and their learning process. Some learn earlier than others. Others takes time. But one of the things I've noticed in the video that we watched was that the baby didn't seem necessarily comfortable walking just because it had a hard time balancing, taking a proper step. So some of the things I've noticed was its choppy steps, had a wide base of support to help maintain its balance, took high steps at times, and it walks with its hands up. I've actually noticed this in the video and also with my daughter. When she began to walk, she was walking with her hands up. It seemed to help her maintain balance. And the same thing in the video. It seemed like the child felt more balanced walking with his hands up. It's very common for infants to be like that. I believe it took my daughter a good 13 months or so for her to actually stop dropping her hands down. Another thing I've noticed was fixed eyes. Now, infants fix their eyes on objects that are still, and this helps them maintain balance a little bit more rather than having them walk and looking all over the place. This causes them to lose balance just because they're not really comfortable with the actual walking process. And again, regaining balance throughout the whole entire thing. It takes time. It's not an easy process for infants to learn how to walk. Some of the constraints, lack of muscular endurance, tiring out. I know there's a lot of times where we had to actually rub my daughter's legs because her legs were just sore. She couldn't handle it very much. We try to progress it as the weeks go by instead of just throwing her out there and say, hey, walk now. Lack of balance. This has to do with muscular endurance. Obviously, when the muscles wear out, it's hard to maintain balance throughout a whole gait cycle. And one of the things I've actually experienced is not being able to explore. And what I mean by this is overprotective parents not allowing the child or the infant to explore. Explore its environment, try to learn how to do things on its own, like walking. Overprotective parents sometimes hinder them in the learning process, whether it's just hovering around them too much as they're trying to walk or holding their hand for long periods of time, causing them to become dependent on the parent. And one of the biggest things that can come out of this is separation anxiety, and that's something that's really hard to recover from. And it's really hard for a lot of parents to actually accept, because in their mind that they don't really feel like they're causing this to their infants, to their child. So that's one of the things a lot of parents need to just keep in mind on. The baby does need to learn. It does need to be dependent on the parent at times, but it also needs to learn how to learn on its own. So moving on from there, we're going into childhood. In this stage of life, much more proficient in walking, better balance, more comfortable with their body, to a certain extent. Unfortunately, the growth kind of affects the way they move. I've noticed a lot that the head size, it's bigger than the rest of the body, so this causes a problem for them to maintain balance throughout the time. But as I said, they become a little bit more proficient, becoming a little bit more comfortable with themselves as they continue to grow. But because of the growth of the head, this does become a problem sometimes. Causes balance to decrease, but not much. As they become more comfortable with themselves, they begin to regain their balance better, increase muscle endurance and stuff like that. One of the biggest constraints in this stage is bow-leggedness. This can be actually detected in the early childhood stage, but if it's not corrected by the time they hit in the toddler stage, it can be a problem. They would have a better base of support, but in the long run, it can cause a problem to knees, or even the hips, and that's something you want to stay away from. Surgery at that young of age is definitely not something you want to have your child to go through. Going on from childhood, we go into adulthood. I'm a little bit more familiar with this stage of life, mainly because in my line of work, I work with more adults. So again, we're proficient in both phases of Gait. One of the biggest things I want to hit is the constraints. So when it comes down to constraints, some of the things I've noticed in my field, I'm a personal trainer, so I work a lot with people who are sedentary and or do a lot of repeated movements. And because of these things, some of the constraints I've noticed: upper extremity movement impairment syndrome. This is on the picture on the right, and this is when they have rounded shoulders and a forward head. This can be due to a sedentary job, working on the computer a lot, staying hunched over a lot. So stuff like that, it can be corrected, but it does take time. So one of the things that I like to push on to my clients is have them realize what they're doing. A lot of the times when we do a certain job or with our lifestyles, we really kind of don't pay attention to how our posture is. And this can actually be a problem in the long run. So what we do now eventually carries over into our older adulthood. So with the upper extremity movement impairment syndrome, we want to take note of this, just because later on it can progress to kyphosis, and we don't want that. So being able to keep our shoulders back, stay up tall, would be really ideal. I help my clients strengthen the weakened muscles and try to lengthen the tight muscles. I don't do any type of physical therapy because that's not my line of work. But I definitely wanted to keep them from going to a physical therapist, just that way, they don't invest more time and money into something that they can correct with simple workouts. Another constraint I've actually experienced: lower cross extremity movement impairment syndrome. This is where there's excessive flexion or extension of the hips. This is the picture on the left, as well as knee valgus, which is knee knock, and then also pronation of the feet, flat foot. A lot of this comes from stuff that we do throughout the day. For the flexion in our hips, or the excessive flexion in our hips, this is if we're seated for long periods of time. Our hips get accustomed to being in a flexed position, and they tend to stay in that position. And this can actually cause a problem, just because when you start doing things, you're going to have constantly tight hips, and that's something that becomes very uncomfortable. The knee knock, again, that's something you want to look into as well, just because that actually applies a lot of pressure to the knee, and we definitely do not want to have knee pains when we're not doing very much. And the flat foot, this could actually be a lot of things that factor into this. The shoes that we wear throughout the day actually play a major role, just because some of the times we wear shoes that aren't necessarily fit for us, forcing our feet into stuff that we shouldn't be forcing our feet into, or wearing just shoes that are elevated for a long period of time. It could be a variety of things: walking upstairs in those kind of shoes, dress shoes, stuff like that. And another thing is lordosis. I've only ran a couple people like this, but this is more of something. This is the constraint because it can actually affect the way that we walk, just like the other constraints that we have. Moving on to adulthood, this is this is the stage of life where everything that we did prior comes back to get us. So if we do have an upper extremity movement impairment syndrome, it can get worse. As I mentioned earlier, it can become kyphosis, but this kyphosis can happen to anybody. I'm not saying like exercise at a certain age is going to be the medicine for anything. We all respond differently just to different stimulus. That's what makes us different from one another, which is great, because if we were all the same, we would either be walking Arnold Schwarzenegger's all over the place and or walking in crutches all day for the rest of our lives. So that's something that we don't want, and we should be grateful that we are created differently. Some look at it as a good thing, some obviously don't, just because some respond significantly well to little to no movement. So when it comes to older adulthood, one of the things I've observed is basically slower everything. We do decrease in balance, we do decrease in muscle endurance, muscle strength, and there's not much we can do, but we can slow this process down with regular exercise, a good, well-balanced diet, being active as much as we can, and making sure we are paying attention to the way our body is, posture-wise. The taking action as fast as we can would definitely help us from having problems later down the road. Some of the constraints, again, decrease muscle strength and endurance. There's not much we can do for that. We can just work out or have an exercise routine that we can stick to and just try to maintain muscle mass as much as we can. Like a balance, unfortunately, there's not much we can do for that, just because there's a lot of things that play in balance itself rather than just muscle. Our vision does play a role in our balance, and so does our hearing. Some people really wouldn't think that, but at times it really does. And neuromuscular proprioception, decrease in that. So all in all, stuff that happened to us, we have control over once we hit a certain stage of our life. Obviously, as we learned how to walk in our early childhood, we progress into our childhood, and hopefully we have good postural alignments, no movement distortions, or any type of bow-leggedness, or any type of deviation that can affect us later down the road. As we hit our adulthood, we want to make sure we become active, because in that stage of life, what we do will carry over into our older adulthood, and we want to be able to, as an exercise science major, I would like to promote fitness as much as possible. No matter what kind of fitness it is, being active is as important to our lives as eating, socializing, you name it. So being active will definitely help us in the long run. We do have control of a lot of things in our lives. With that being said, thank you for your time. You have a wonderful day.